The snow fell on Chicago that night as though the sky had decided to bury the city alive, and with it, every trace of the people it had already given up on. The worst blizzard in 10 years swallowed the streets of the South Side, erasing footprints faster than they could be made, as if the city itself wanted to pretend that those who had fallen had never walked there at all. Through that white silence, a woman dragged a suitcase across the frozen sidewalk, her head bowed against the wind, hands that had held so many patients through their worst nights, now trembling in the cold, useless in the snow. She ducked into the mouth of an abandoned subway station, sank down against the tiled wall, and held the medical bag to her chest the way a child holds the hand of a mother who is no longer there. Then, from the darkness deeper in the station, came a sound. The dry clash of metal, a muffled grunt, the heavy thud of a body hitting the ground. When Sienna dared to look, she saw 3 figures in the dim glow of a dying emergency light. 2 standing, one on his knees, and then, within a few heartbeats, everything reversed. The kneeling man rose to his full height, and his movements were so decisive, so cold, that she forgot to breathe. The other 2 fled up the stairs into the storm, running as though from something more terrifying than death itself. The remaining man stepped into the light. Tall, broad-shouldered, a black coat slashed open along the ribs where a knife had found him. He walked with a faint hitch in his right leg, the mark of an old wound, and then, without warning, he collapsed against the wall, one hand clawing at his own throat, gasping like a drowning man on dry land. Suffocating in the still, silent dark, Sienna did the only thing she knew. She began to hum her mother's lullaby, softly, to steady her own shaking heart, and impossibly, his breathing slowed. His hand shot out and caught her wrist. "I'll pay you any price," he rasped. "Just one thing. Don't stop singing until the sun comes up." And in Sienna's mind, only one question remained. A man who had just sent 2 armed attackers fleeing without daring to look back. What could live in the silent darkness that choked him so completely he would beg a stranger for a lullaby? Subscribe to our channel and journey with us through stories of healing, where kindness always finds its way home. The offer hung suspended between them, heavier than all the snow falling on the city above. Sienna did not move. Every nerve in her body was screaming a single command. Get up, grab the suitcase, disappear into the storm before it is too late. She had lived long enough on the edges of this city to know one rule that had never failed her. Men who offered money to strange women in the middle of the night were never the beginning of anything good, and a man who could send 2 armed attackers running into a blizzard without daring to look back was not the kind of man a sensible woman stayed near. Her feet were already shifting beneath her, ready to run. But then she looked at him more closely, and that look changed everything. The man was dying in front of her, and he did not even know it. He was trying to hide it, his jaw clenched, his shoulders still squared against the wall. But Sienna had spent too many years beside hospital beds not to read the signs written all over him. The knife wound along his ribs had already soaked through 3 layers of fabric, a dark stain spreading wider with every breath. His lips were turning the bruised violet of hypothermia, and worse than either of those, his airway was still spasming, each inhale a thin, strangled whistle, the kind of sound that killed men before blood loss ever got the chance. Her survival instinct told her to run. Her professional instinct held her to the ground. For a few heartbeats, the 2 fought inside her like opposing currents in a frozen river, and then her mother's voice rose from somewhere deep. The words she had grown up on. The words stitched into her the way the lullaby was stitched into that brass music box. A nurse's hands are never allowed to turn away from someone gasping for air. It was both the gift and the curse of the profession her mother had handed down to her, and tonight, crouched in a dead subway station with a dangerous stranger, she felt that curse tighten around her chest. In the end, she let out a long breath, and the nurse won. It always won. "Your side," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "You're losing blood, and your airway is worse. If I leave you here, you won't see morning." She pulled the medical bag forward, knelt beside him on the freezing concrete, and her hands went to work with a familiarity that required no thought. She cut the fabric away from the wound, cleaned it with antiseptic that made him hiss through his teeth, and closed the gash with the emergency suture kit her mother had taught her never to travel without. And the whole time, between instructions, she kept humming, low and steady, because every time the melody faltered, his breathing began to claw at itself again. "I don't want your money," she said as she tied off the last stitch. "I'm doing this because I can't walk away from a man who's suffocating, not because of your offer. Do you understand?" He stared at her through the dim light, and in his exhausted eyes was the look of a man studying a riddle he could not solve, as if she were written in a language his world had never taught him. Then headlights swept the station stairs, and a black car glided to the curb above, silent as the night itself. The driver asked no questions. He simply gave the wounded man a slight nod and opened the door, as though carrying a bleeding stranger and a soaked nurse out of a dead subway station were the most ordinary duty in the world. Sienna sat pressed into one corner of the back seat, painfully aware of her wet coat and ruined shoes against leather that smelled of money. No one spoke for the entire ride. The man rested his head against the window with his eyes closed, but she knew he was not sleeping, because his fingers never stopped drumming a restless rhythm against his knee, the rhythm of someone who had never once allowed himself to truly rest. The car stopped before a tower that rose so high she had to crane her neck to find the top of it, and an elevator carried them upward until her ears rang, opening at last onto a penthouse suspended above the frozen sweep of Lake Michigan, where the ice stretched out beneath them like a plain of shattered silver. She had cared for wealthy patients in grand houses before, but she had never stood in a place like this, a place where even the silence smelled of power. And yet what caught her attention was not the grandeur, it was the emptiness. The room was enormous, but there was no trace of a life being lived in it. Not a single framed photograph, not one unnecessary object, not one small piece of warm human disorder. It looked less like a home than a fortress. And there was something else, something stranger still. Every light in the place was burning, every lamp, every recessed bulb, every fixture down every hallway, all of them blazing at nearly 1 a.m, as though darkness itself had been banished from the premises by decree. A large man stepped out from the corridor, his hair cropped short, his shoulders like a wall, and his eyes swept over Sienna with the cold efficiency of someone trained to measure a threat in the space of a blink. "Mr. Moretti," the man said, his voice low and graveled, his gaze never leaving her. "I didn't know you had a guest." So now she knew his name, Moretti, and somehow the name fit him, old and heavy, like iron. "She's a nurse, Rocco," Moretti replied, easing out of his ruined coat. "She's staying tonight." The man called Rocco nodded and asked nothing more, but Sienna felt the vigilance in every movement he made, the way he placed himself between her and the rest of the room, loyal down to the marrow. She did not mind it. That wariness, at least, was honest. What unsettled her came from another direction. At the far end of the hallway, a second man leaned against a doorframe, younger, immaculate, a courteous smile fixed on his lips like a tie knotted too perfectly. When Moretti passed, the man bowed his head in polite greeting. But the instant Moretti's back was turned, his gaze slid after him, and something moved through it, some cold, calculating glint that vanished so quickly Sienna wondered if the blazing lights had played a trick on her. Then he stepped back into a shadowed corner, drew out his phone, turned his back to everyone, and began speaking very softly. Rocco led her to a guest room with a bed dressed in spotless white, but Sienna could not sleep. Through the wall came footsteps, steady, restless, pacing for hours, and beneath them, fainter, the sound of light switches being tested, one by one, down every hall. At last, unable to resist the nurse inside her, Sienna rose, pulled her coat over her shoulders, and followed the trail of burning lights down the hallway. She found him in a room lined with books she suspected were rarely opened, standing by the tall window with a glass of whiskey in his hand that had never once touched his lips. Beyond the glass, the frozen lake glowed faintly under the storm clouds, and every lamp in the room blazed as though it were noon. "You should be lying down," she said softly. "Those stitches need rest." He turned, and under the yellow light his face looked even more worn than it had in the subway station. The exhaustion carved so deep it seemed part of the bone. "Lying down doesn't do anything," he replied, and there was a bitter, self-mocking edge in his voice. "I can't remember the last time I made it through a whole night." She stepped closer and checked the bandage along his ribs, and he let her, as though he were too tired to resist. "You must think I've lost my mind," he said while she worked. A grown man begging a stranger in a subway station to sing until sunrise. "I've paid the best specialists in this country, men people wait a year to see. I've swallowed enough sedatives to drop a horse. Some of them knocked me unconscious, but that isn't sleep. That's just a darker room. They wired my skull, shone lights through my brain, ran their machines all night, and then shook their heads and wrote another prescription. None of it touches this thing. The moment the dark goes quiet, my chest closes like a fist. So when I heard you humming down there, and my lungs opened for the first time in longer than I can remember, I stopped caring how insane it sounded. It was the confession of a man who had run out of road." Sienna sat down in the chair across from him, and for the first time since the subway station, she looked at him not as a danger, but as a patient, She had seen this kind of exhaustion before, the kind that eroded a person from the inside until sleep became an enemy instead of a refuge. "You're not insane," she said. "You're just tired. More tired than medicine can reach." And then, almost without thinking, her hand slipped into her coat and drew out her mother's brass music box. The small worn thing she had carried for years like a charm. She wound the key with a motion so familiar it required no thought, because it was what her mother had always done beside the beds of patients who could not sleep, and set it on the table between them. The lullaby rose into the bright room, slow, steady, unhurried, a melody that never rushed and never stopped. She said nothing more, and then something strange began to happen. Moretti's breathing slowed. His fingers, clenched white around the arm of the chair, loosened one by one. The strained lines of his face eased, like a rope bound too tightly for too long finally being released. And before the song had wound down twice, the most powerful man on the south side had sunk into sleep, breathing freely, deeply, for the first time in 4 years. Sienna kept watch over him all night, the way her mother had taught her, and when dawn spilled gray gold across the frozen lake, and he opened his eyes to sunlight, he looked at her with an expression she would never forget, astonishment edged with something close to fear, the look of a man handed back a thing he had believed was lost forever. That morning, for the first time since she had stepped into the tower, Moretti looked like a different man, not restored, exactly, because 4 years of stolen nights could not be erased by a single one, but something in his eyes had settled, like water after a storm finally passes. He found her in the kitchen, where she was making coffee and trying not to touch anything that cost more than her monthly rent had. "I want you to stay," he said directly, without circling. "Not for one night, long term. You'll have your own quarters, and you'll be paid more generously than any hospital ever paid you. All you have to do is exactly what you did last night." Sienna set the cup down slowly, and the old wariness rose in her at once, the instinct that had carried her through too many cold streets and too many closed doors. Everything about this sounded easy, and in her life, anything that sounded easy had always come with a hidden trap. "You don't even know my name," she said. "Sienna Walsh," he answered without hesitation, and she went very still. "Rocco looked into you last night. I know you're a licensed oncology nurse with 6 years at the bedside. I know Street. Augustin let you go a month ago and stamped your file so no hospital in this city will touch you. I know you're still carrying your mother's medical debt, that you don't owe a cent to anyone else, and that you have no address. And I know you're the legal guardian of an orphaned boy you've been paying a friend to shelter." A chill ran down her spine as she listened to her own life recited so smoothly, like pages read from a folder. "So you know I'm desperate," she said slowly. "And you think that makes me easy to buy." Moretti did not deny it, and he did not look offended. "I think it means we can help each other. You need a roof. I need something this entire fortune has never been able to buy me. That's a fair exchange, Miss Walsh. Nothing more and nothing less." She looked at him for a long time, weighing it. She knew exactly where she was standing. She knew the man in front of her lived in a world of silent black cars and blazing midnight lights and knife wounds he refused to explain, a world she did not understand and did not want to. But she also knew the cold of a night with nowhere to go, and she knew she could not keep wrapping her pride around herself like a coat forever. "If I stay," she said at last, "it's on my terms. I'm your nurse. Nothing else. I have my own room with a door that locks, and you never cross that threshold without my permission. I look after you when you need it, but I don't belong to you. I'm not your property, and I'm not a fixture in this building. And the day I decide to leave, I walk out that door without explaining myself to anyone." A brief silence. Then he nodded. "Agreed." "I'm not finished," she said, her voice hardening. "I don't want to know what you do to own all of this. I don't ask, and you don't tell me. I mend bodies, Mr. Moretti. That's my work. Whatever happens outside that elevator is your business, and I want it to stay out there." She wondered if he would be angry. Instead, the corner of his mouth lifted faintly, with that look of near admiration she had glimpsed in the station. "You're the first person in years who has dared to set conditions with me," he said. "Then maybe it's time someone dared," she replied. They shook hands, 2 strangers sealing an agreement both of them pretended was far simpler than it truly was, and as she released his hand, Sienna promised herself she would never forget who this man really was, and that she would keep her heart locked as tightly as the door to her room. The nights that followed settled into a rhythm of their own, and Sienna, who had been trained to observe and remember every small symptom in a patient, began to notice a pattern. She tested it carefully, the way she would trace the source of a fever. On the second night, She kept the music box in her coat pocket and simply sat quietly in the reading room while he tried to rest, and Moretti tossed until nearly dawn, rising twice to walk the halls, checking the lights, his breath tightening every time the silence grew too deep. On the third night, she wound the brass key and set the box on the table as she had done that first night, and in less than 1 hour, his breathing had slipped into the deep, even rhythm of true sleep. She repeated it again and again over the weeks that followed, not out of idle curiosity, but because she needed to understand, and the result never changed. It was not her presence that let him sleep. It was not the room, not the burning lamps, not the exhaustion stacked inside him like stones. It was the melody, that slow, patient, old-world tune, unwinding note by note, never rushing and never stopping, reached someplace deep inside him that medicine and machines had never been able to touch. Sienna was a nurse, not a psychologist, but she had sat beside enough beds to know that some wounds did not live on the skin. There were kinds of pain carved so deeply into a person that the body refused to loosen, refused to believe that closing one's eyes in the quiet dark could ever be safe. And she began to suspect that this man carried a wound like that, something that had happened in silence and shadow, something that had taught him, once and forever, that stillness was the sound of loss arriving. She did not ask. That was their agreement. And more than that, she knew there were doors people had to open on their own, doors that could not be pried apart with curious questions. But the answer found its way to her on a night when she was not expecting it. He had been asleep for more than an hour, his face more peaceful than she had ever seen it, when suddenly his whole body jerked, his breathing turned harsh and frantic, his hands rose from the chair and clawed at the empty air in front of him, fingers spread and scraping, the way a person claws at a wooden door that will not open. And before he had fully woken, a single word broke out of him, hoarse and shattered. Mama, only that. But it carried a weight that made Sienna go cold to her fingertips. It was not the voice of the most feared man on the South Side. It was the voice of a child left behind in the dark. He sat bolt upright, chest heaving, eyes staring into the bright room without seeing it, and for one long moment, he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere very far away, and very long ago. Sienna did not move toward him. She only reached out and quietly wound the music box again, letting the lullaby rise clear and steady into the room, and she watched the man come back to the present, breath by breath, the panic draining slowly from his eyes. He realized she was there. He realized what he had said, and for an instant his face closed itself off like a fortress sealing its gates, the defensive stillness of an animal caught at its weakest moment. "I'm sorry I woke you," he said stiffly, his voice already armored again. "You don't need to apologize," she answered softly. She did not ask who he had been calling for. She did not ask what had happened. She only sat there in the lamplight, letting the melody do its patient work, and after a long while, he lay back and closed his eyes. But Sienna stayed awake the rest of the night, her heart heavy with the sound of that one broken word, spoken with all the love and all the terror a human being could carry. She still did not know how Moretti made his living, and she had promised not to ask. But there were some things a person did not need to ask in order to see. One gray afternoon, when he said he had a few matters to handle in the old neighborhood, and she rode along to change the dressing on his healing ribs, she saw it for herself. The car stopped on a narrow street on the far south side, where the snow lay in tired drifts against brick buildings that had been beautiful 50 years ago. Moretti stepped into a small corner diner, and Sienna followed a pace behind, and what she found inside made her stomach tighten. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged woman, a widow named Ruth Delgado, her hands trembling around a dish towel, her face drained white. Looming over the counter was a heavy-set man in an expensive coat, one of the men who worked under Moretti, a debt collector by the name of Vince Caro. And at that moment, he was slamming his palm down on the countertop, demanding twice the sum the woman had borrowed, threatening to take the diner itself, the little place that was everything her family had. Sienna saw the woman's eyes dart toward the kitchen door, where a teenage boy stood frozen with a tub of dishes in his hands, and saw her push him gently back and pull the door shut, as though trying to build a wall between her son and the shame unfolding in the front room. Moretti stood silently in the doorway for a moment, watching, and Sienna felt the temperature of the room drop by degrees. When he finally spoke, he did not raise his voice at all. "Vince," just one word, spoken very softly, but the big man jerked as if struck with a whip, spun around, and every ounce of aggression on his face dissolved into naked fear. "Mr. Moretti," he stammered, "I didn't know you were coming down here. I was only collecting what's owed, like you instructed, like I instructed." Moretti repeated the words, his voice still gentle, and there was something in it that froze the entire room. He stepped forward, one unhurried stride at a time, and the faint hitch in his right leg did not make him seem weaker. It made him more frightening, like something that could not be stopped and had never needed to hurry. I told you to collect the amount that was loaned. I did not tell you to double it. I did not tell you to threaten a widow's livelihood. And I certainly did not tell you to walk into a place where there was a boy and make his mother close a door out of shame. Vince opened his mouth, and Moretti lifted one hand, and the man fell silent at once. What do you think power is? Moretti said. And now he stood close enough that his voice dropped to almost a whisper, yet every person in the room heard every word. Do you think it means tightening your grip around the throats of people who have nothing left to fight you with? A real man never gets stronger by trampling someone weaker. That isn't strength. That is cowardice wearing the clothing of strength. He turned to Rocco, who had entered behind them without a sound, and gave a slight signal. Mrs. Delgado's debt is cleared. All of it. And Vince doesn't set foot in this neighborhood again. See to it. Rocco led the shaken man out, and Moretti laid a thick fold of bills on the counter, enough to repair the worn little diner twice over, then turned and walked out before the stunned woman could finish stammering her thanks. In the car, Sienna studied him for a long moment, her mind tangled with everything she had just felt, the fear and the other thing beneath it. Why? She finally asked. Why bother with one small diner and a debt that means nothing to you? Moretti looked out through the window at the passing snow, and it was a long while before he answered, his voice distant. Because I know what it feels like to be crushed under the foot of someone stronger when you have nothing in your hands. I know that feeling better than anyone alive. There was one thing about her life that Sienna had never told Moretti, and that was Eli, the 7-year-old boy she was raising, the son of the closest friend she had ever had, a friend taken from this world in a highway accident 2 years earlier along with her husband, leaving behind the most precious burden Sienna had ever been trusted with. Since the crash, Eli had almost stopped speaking. Words had simply gone quiet inside him, the way a house goes dark room by room, and no doctor, no counselor, no patient coaxing had been able to switch them back on. All this time, she had been leaving him with a trusted friend across the city, sending every dollar she could spare for his care. But when Moretti learned of him through Rocco, he said only one simple thing, that this building was wide enough for both of them, and that a child should be with his family. And so, on a bright Saturday morning, when the storm had finally broken, Eli set foot in the penthouse for the first time. He was not overwhelmed by its size or its luxury, the way Sienna had feared. He was not overwhelmed by anything anymore, and that was the wound of it. He simply walked to the great glass wall, sat down cross-legged on the floor with the small stack of paper Sienna kept in her bag for him, and began to fold, silently, patiently, his small hands moving through creases he knew by heart. One boat, then another, a quiet fleet gathering on the carpet, facing the frozen lake below. Moretti stood in the doorway, strangely helpless, the man who could empty a room with one softly spoken word, not knowing what to do before a silent child. He did not try charm, and he did not try questions. He simply lowered himself, with some difficulty because of his ribs and his leg, and sat down on the floor a small distance away, saying nothing, the two of them watching the ice together. Long minutes passed. Then Eli looked at him for a while, the unhurried, X-ray look of a child measuring something adults cannot see, and he reached out and placed one paper boat into Moretti's scarred hand. And then came the voice, the first voice in many months, small as a breath, so quiet the room seemed to lean in to hear it. My dad said paper boats are so you float, so you don't sink. A pause, the kind of pause that holds a whole ocean. You look like someone who's sinking. The innocent sentence hung in the air, and Sienna, frozen in the kitchen doorway with her heart in her throat, saw something break and heal in Moretti's eyes at the very same time. The man held that clumsy little boat in hands that had frightened half a city, staring at it for a long moment as though it were made of something far heavier than paper. When he finally spoke, his voice came out entirely different, low and careful, as if handling glass. Then you'd better teach me how to make one, so I don't sink. And to Sienna's astonishment, that was exactly what happened. All that gray afternoon, the fortress above the lake, filled with the soft sounds of folding paper, and the boys whispered, halting instructions, each word a small miracle climbing out of its silence, while the most dangerous man on the south side bent over sheet after sheet, ruining fold after fold with hands that trembled slightly, and starting again without complaint, until one crooked boat finally stood. That evening, passing the study, Sienna stopped short. Through the open door she saw Moretti carefully setting the little paper boat on his desk, adjusting it once, then again, placing it exactly where he would see it every single day. The story was finally told late one night, after Eli had fallen deeply asleep down the hall, when Moretti and Sienna sat together in the reading room, with only the lullaby unwinding between them. Perhaps it was the little paper boat standing watch on his desk. Perhaps he was simply too tired of carrying it alone. He began softly, his eyes fixed on the empty air, as though he were reading from an old page he knew by heart, every single word, but had never once dared to read aloud. He told her he was 12 years old the winter it happened. His father owed his life to dangerous men and owed his debts to worse ones. And one night, the worst of them came to collect. He remembered being shaken awake in the dark, his mother's hands on his shoulders, her breath quick against his ear. Isabella Moretti did not scream and did not run. She pulled her son across the bedroom floor, folded him into the wardrobe among the winter coats, and pressed her lips to the thin gap in the door. "She told me to be her brave boy," Moretti said. "She told me that no matter what I heard, I was not to open the door. And then she did the thing she always did when I couldn't sleep, when there were storms, when the electricity failed. She hummed, right there against the crack in the wood, so softly no one else could have heard it. That old lullaby, the one her own mother carried over from the old country. She said, 'As long as you can hear the song, it means I'm still here.'" His fingers had gone perfectly still on the armrest, and his voice, when it came again, was even and terrible. So I listened. I heard the front door break. I heard men's voices, and things falling, and my father begging. And through all of it, under all of it, I could still hear her. That thread of melody through the crack in the door. She never stopped. Not when they shouted, not when the shots came from the front of the house. She kept singing so that I wouldn't be afraid, so that I wouldn't cry out and give myself away. And then, he paused, and the music box turned patiently through its notes, and Sienna did not breathe. And then the song stopped. The words fell into the bright room like stones into still water. I did what she told me. I didn't open the door. I sat in that wardrobe in the absolute dark, in the absolute quiet, and I counted the seconds. I counted all night, waiting for the song to start again. It never did. When the light finally came through the crack, I opened the door. He did not describe what he found, and Sienna did not need him to, because the ruin in his voice had already said everything. "I was in that silent darkness all night," he said. And for the first time since she had known him, his voice broke apart. And ever since, every time the night goes quiet, my chest closes up as though the song has only just stopped. 24 years, and my body still believes that silence is the sound of her leaving. Sienna sat very still, and in one breathless, aching instant, she understood everything. Why the lights burned all night in every room, why stillness strangled him, and machines could not reach it, and why her mother's music box, winding out that same old-world lullaby, could lull him to sleep when a fortune's worth of medicine had failed, because it spoke directly to the deepest, most wounded part of him, telling it the only thing it had ever needed to hear. "Tonight the song has not stopped. Tonight no one is leaving you." She offered him no hollow words of comfort, because she knew no words could reach that kind of pain. Instead, she only stretched her hand quietly across the space between them, and laid it over his, the hand of a boy who had counted the dark alone. And she kept it there, warm and unmoving, until dawn was nearly breaking over the frozen lake. After he had poured out his pain, a gentle silence settled between them, broken only by the slow turning of the melody, and Sienna understood that now it was her turn. He had opened his door all the way to its darkest room. It would be unfair, she thought, to keep her own locked. She looked down at the brass music box on the table, its small key still turning, and for the first time she told him about its true owner. "This belonged to my mother," she began, her fingers lightly touching the casing, worn smooth by decades of winding. "She was a seamstress. She raised me alone in a 2-room apartment above a laundry, and she never once let me feel poor. When I couldn't sleep, she would wind this box and hum along with it while she worked, and I would drift off to the sound of the melody and her sewing machine together. To me, that was the sound of safety. That was the sound of someone staying." She drew a slow breath. "When I was 19, she found a lump. Cancer. And I did the only thing that made sense to me. I became an oncology nurse. I told myself that if I learned everything, if I trained harder than anyone, I could take care of her with my own hands. And I did. 6 years, every treatment, every protocol. I was there beside her chair. I measured everything myself. I checked every line, every dose, every milligram against the standard, because that was the one thing I could control." Her voice tightened. "But the treatments didn't work. Cycle after cycle. The doctors kept saying she wasn't responding. The tumors kept growing as though the medicine weren't even reaching them. Everyone said it was just biology, just bad luck, that some patients simply don't respond. And I believed them, because what else could I believe? I had done everything right." She was quiet for a moment, and when she went on, her voice had dropped to almost nothing. "The last night, I sat beside her bed and I counted her breaths. That's what they train us to do, count. And every time this melody wound down, I would reach over and turn the key again. Over and over, all night, as though as long as the song hadn't ended, she was still here, as though the music could hold her." Her eyes glistened in the lamplight, but she did not look away from him. "I'm an oncology nurse, Adrian. I have saved so many strangers. I have pulled people back who had no business surviving, and when it was the one person my whole life was built around, I sat there winding a music box and I couldn't keep her." As those words left her, something changed in the room. The two of them sat there, a kingpin of the South Side and a nurse with nothing to her name, two people who should have had nothing in common at all, and yet they were looking into each other's eyes and seeing their own wound reflected back, perfectly, terribly. Both of them had once clung to a sound to hold on to someone who was leaving. Both of them had counted through a long night, bargaining with the dark. Both of them carried the same nameless debt, the quiet, unkillable belief that surely they should have been able to do more. Moretti looked at her for a long time, and then he said the thing she had not expected, the thing that undid her. "So we're more alike than you think. Both of us are living by a song whose singer is gone." And in that moment, the final distance between them, that careful wall of suspicion Sienna had built brick by brick from the first night, quietly dissolved. Not through a romantic gesture, not through a confession of love, but through something far deeper and far rarer, the complete understanding between two souls carrying the same scar, listening to the same melody, each keeping watch so the other would not have to count the dark alone. But that newly formed closeness did not last long before the brutal reality of Moretti's world came crashing in and shattered it. It happened on a night when Eli was away, sleeping over at the home of Sienna's friend across the city, a small mercy she would be grateful for until the end of her days. She had just turned off her reading lamp when the sounds began. Shouts from the floor below, muffled but violent, the thunder of hurried footsteps on the service stairs, doors slamming somewhere deep in the building's bones. When Sienna stepped out of her room, her heart already climbing into her throat, she came upon a sight that turned her blood cold. Rocco and 3 other men she had never seen before were escorting a stranger down the corridor, a man whose face had gone the gray-white of old snow, whose feet stumbled as though the floor kept moving beneath them, and whose eyes darted everywhere and found no help anywhere. The air in the hallway was thick with a kind of threat she had never felt so nakedly before, not even in the subway station that first night, and in the middle of it all stood Adrian Moretti. But it was not the man who had lowered himself to the floor to learn paper boats from a silent child. It was not the man whose hand she had covered with her own until dawn, the man who had wept without tears over a song that had stopped 24 years ago. This man's face was carved from something that gave back no light. His voice, when he spoke to Rocco, was quiet and precise, and utterly without temperature, issuing instructions she could not hear and did not want to hear. This was someone else entirely, a kingpin conducting the business of the underworld in the small hours of the night, in the same halls where a little boy's paper boats sat drying on the windowsills. He did not see her. She made sure of it, stepping back into her room and closing the door with hands that would not stop trembling. And all that night, Sienna lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle back into its terrible silence. But this time her sleeplessness was not for him. It was not worry over his stitches or his breathing or his haunted nights. It was for herself, for how easily she had let the walls come down. She had let herself forget. Somewhere between the music box in the diner and the paper boat on his desk, she had allowed herself to forget who this man truly was, what world paid for these bright rooms, and what kinds of debts were collected in its shadows. And above all, it was for Eli, for the small boy who had finally begun to speak again under this roof, whose laughter had returned in fragile pieces, and who could have been home tonight, could have opened his door at the wrong moment and seen what she had seen, or worse. She thought of her friend, of the promise she had whispered at a graveside 2 years ago, that she would keep that child safe with everything she had, and she knew, with a certainty that felt like grief, what she had to do. The next morning, she stood in the doorway of his study with her suitcase already packed, and her face pale but set like stone. Moretti looked up from his desk, and she saw him take in the suitcase, and she saw that he understood before she said a single word. She said it anyway, because he deserved to hear it, and she deserved to have to say it. I have to take Eli away. I'm sorry. I know what I agreed to, and I know what you've done for both of us. But last night I saw your world with my own eyes, and I cannot let a child grow up next to the things that can happen here. I swore to his mother that I would keep him safe, and that promise has to matter more than anything else. Even she left the sentence unfinished, not daring to speak the rest of it aloud. Moretti was silent for a long while, and Sienna braced herself for what she knew was coming. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for threats, for cold negotiation, for the machinery of power she had seen him wield with nothing more than a softly spoken name. A man like him, a man who could make an entire neighborhood hold its breath, could keep her in this building without ever raising his voice. She had seen with her own eyes what one quiet word from him could do. She gripped the handle of her suitcase and waited for it, but it never came. Instead, Adrian Moretti nodded, slowly, and when he lifted his eyes to hers, there was no anger in them at all. There was only a deep, still sadness, and beneath it an understanding so complete that it hurt her more than any fury could have. You're right, he said softly. A child deserves to grow up in the light, not in the dark, and you're a good guardian for putting him above everything else. Above comfort, above safety, even above. He stopped, the same unfinished sentence she had left hanging in the doorway, and neither of them dared to complete it. He turned to the window for a moment, to the pale morning spread across the frozen lake, and then he did the thing she had least expected. He called for Rocco and instructed him, in a voice that allowed no discussion, to prepare a car to take Miss Walsh and the boy wherever she wished to go, and to see that she carried enough money to begin again somewhere safe, with no conditions attached and no accounting expected. I will never stop you from doing what you believe is right, he said, turning back to her. You came into my life as a free woman, and you'll leave it as a free woman. I only regret. He stopped again. He did not finish, but she understood. He regretted that his world was not a place where she could stay. Sienna took her suitcase and walked to the elevator, and that should have been the end of it. The doors slid open. Her hand came up to hold them, and in that suspended moment, standing on the threshold between two lives, the realization arrived, quiet and overwhelming, like light through a crack in a door. The man behind her had every means in the world to keep her here. Money that could buy her silence, power that could erase her objections, a single soft word that could close every road out of this city, and he had used none of it. He had simply opened his hand and let her go, had placed her freedom and Eli's safety above the one thing he feared more than anything on this earth, the silence of an empty home, the song stopping again. A truly dangerous man would never have let her leave. Only a man who truly respected her could have done it, and the man who had just done it, she understood with sudden, aching clarity, was not the darkness she had seen in that hallway. He was the one standing inside that darkness, holding a door open toward the light for everyone but himself. Sienna stood there, one hand on the elevator door, torn between the fear that had taken root in her the night before and the truth that had just bloomed through it. And then, slowly, she let the doors close, with her still standing on the outside of them. She stayed, not because the fear was gone, but because she had finally understood the difference between a dark world and a decent man forced to live inside it. But while she and Moretti quietly stepped into this new, unspoken chapter, somewhere else within his empire, in a shadowed corner where a phone glowed against a turned back, a storm was silently beginning to form. Sienna still did not ask about Moretti's business, and he still did not tell her. But there was one principle of his that even she had come to understand without a single question, because everyone in his world spoke of it the way people speak of gravity. Adrian Moretti never touched anything that destroyed human beings. Whatever moved through the South Side under his name, there were lines carved in stone, and the deepest of them, the one he despised down to the marrow of his bones, was tampering with medicine, the poisoning of the sick for profit. So when the wife of his most loyal capo, a gentle woman who had cooked Sunday dinners for half the organization, wasted away and died after months of chemotherapy that had inexplicably failed to touch her illness, and when her grieving husband knelt in Moretti's study whispering that something had been wrong, that the doctors themselves had seemed confused by how completely the treatment had not worked, Moretti did not offer condolences and move on. He ordered his people to dig. The investigation lasted for weeks. Rocco's men followed every thread, every shipment record, every laundered invoice, every quiet transfer between shell companies with pharmaceutical names, and slowly, relentlessly, all of it flowed toward a single point, like blood returning to a A fake medicine operation was running through the supply lines of the city's most respected hospitals, siphoning concentrated chemotherapy compounds, diluting what remained to a fraction of its strength, and selling the stolen difference through the gray markets of 3 states. The sick received water dressed as hope, the dying received invoices. And the man at the center of it all, the man whose signature sat quietly behind every altered shipment, was a pillar of the medical establishment, a face from charity galas and hospital brochures, the executive director of Street Augustine itself. His name was Warren Sloan. The night Rocco laid the file on the desk and spoke that name aloud, Moretti only read in silence, committing every detail of this new enemy to memory, with no way of knowing that the name already carried another meaning inside his own home. It was not until Sienna happened to enter the study with a cup of tea, as she often did in the late evenings now, and her gaze accidentally fell across the photograph clipped inside the open file, that everything broke open. She stopped in the middle of the room. The teacup began to tremble faintly against its saucer, and all the blood seemed to drain from her face. "Why?" she asked, her voice so small it was almost lost beneath the ticking quiet. "Why do you have a photograph of this man?" Moretti looked up and knew at once that something was terribly wrong. "You know him?" She set the cup down before she dropped it, and she stared at the face in the photograph, the tailored suit, the silver temples, the smile made for donor dinners, the face that had presided over the dismantling of her life. "That is the man who destroyed me," she said quietly. "That is the executive I reported, the man I stood in front of with the drug concentration numbers in my hands. He is the one who called my findings hysterical, who stamped my license file, who had security walk me out of the building I had given 6 years of my life to." And then, as Moretti watched, he saw the second realization strike her, and the third, each one landing like a blow. The patients who had not responded, the treatments that had failed for no reason. Her breath left her. 6 years, she whispered. "You said this operation has been running for more than 6 years, through Street Augustine's own supply lines." Her hand rose slowly to her mouth. "My mother was treated at Street Augustine. Every cycle, every dose. I measured everything. I checked everything, and none of it worked. And they told me she simply wasn't responding." Her voice broke, and when it returned, it was made of something between grief and fire. "My mother didn't lose to her disease. She lost to that man's greed." Moretti rose from his chair. He took the photograph from the file and looked at it for a long moment with an expression Sienna could not read, and in his mind, the pieces locked together into something terrible. The man he was hunting for poisoning the sick, and the man who had crushed the woman standing before him, and the man whose watered-down medicine had let her mother slip away beneath her counting hands, were one and the same. He set the photograph down, and when he lifted his eyes, there was a silent promise in them more frightening than any oath spoken aloud. "He will pay," Adrian Moretti said, "for all of it." It turned out that Warren Sloan had also sensed that someone was following his trail, and he was not a man who sat still and waited for the knock at his door. Something was probing the edges of his operation, shipments questioned, middlemen vanishing into silence, and though he could not yet see the face of the hunter, the danger had a shape he recognized. But what he feared most was not the unseen hand moving against his supply lines. It was a name he had believed buried over a year ago, Sienna Walsh, because before she had been walked out of Street Augustine with her career in pieces, she had done the one thing he had never been able to confirm and never been able to forget. She had quietly copied the concentration reports, the mismatched batch numbers, the records that did not align, and carried them out of that building the way a drowning person clings to the last piece of broken wood. She was the only living thread that led from his polished office to the truth. One gray afternoon, when Sienna went out alone to buy new folding paper and winter gloves for Eli, a long silver car glided to the curb beside her, silent and unhurried, and the rear window lowered to reveal the face that had haunted her for a year. Warren Sloan smiled at her the way he smiled in hospital brochures, and invited her in from the cold with the easy courtesy of a man accustomed to hiding cruelty beneath good manners. After a moment of hesitation, Sienna got in, because she knew that sooner or later she would have to face him, and she preferred to do it with her eyes open. Inside, the car smelled of leather and expensive restraint. Sloan did not circle the matter. "Miss Walsh," he said, his voice smooth as velvet drawn over stone, "I think it's time we spoke like adults. I know you kept certain documents, and I know how difficult this year has been for you." He lifted a slim folder from the seat beside him and placed it gently on her lap. "This is an offer. You sign a statement confirming that your previous allegations were an unfortunate misunderstanding, a lapse of judgment made under emotional strain. In return, the entire balance of your mother's medical debt disappears. Your license is restored, your file cleared, there's a senior position waiting, head of your own unit. And the boy you're raising will have his future guaranteed. Schooling, everything. You'll have back everything you lost, Miss Walsh, and more besides." Sienna looked down at the papers on her lap, and for one long moment, temptation closed around her like a cold hand. She thought of the debt that had followed her like a shadow. She thought of the nights she had slept in bus stations. She thought of Eli, of everything she could give him with a single motion of ink, one signature, and all the suffering would end. Her fingers touched the pen he offered, and then she thought of her mother, breathing slower and slower beneath a melody that could not save her, poisoned by the very greed now sitting across from her in a tailored coat. She thought of the capo's gentle wife. She thought of the patients lying in infusion chairs at this very hour, watching diluted hope drip into their veins, trusting the bags hanging above them because they had no other choice. Slowly, Sienna set the pen down and pushed the folder back across the seat. "No," she said, and her voice was so steady it surprised even her. "I won't sign." The smile on Sloane's lips stiffened at its corners. "You should think very carefully, Miss Walsh. This is your last chance. You have nothing. No home, no career, no standing. What exactly do you imagine you can use against me?" "I have the truth," Sienna replied, looking straight into his eyes without blinking. "And I have my conscience. You can take my home, my work, my honor in the eyes of this city. You've already taken all of that. But there is one thing you will never buy from me and never steal out of me, and that is who I am. If I sign this paper, I betray my mother. I betray every patient you are still poisoning at this very moment. I would rather stand empty-handed with my head high than be rich and have to lower my eyes every time I pass a mirror." Sloane looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time, beneath the courteous mask, something venomous surfaced in his eyes, patient and cold. "Then you have just made a very grave mistake," he said softly. The car door opened. Sienna stepped out into the falling snow, her legs trembling and her head held high, leaving behind everything she might have reclaimed, and carrying with her the only thing she would never trade, her own dignity. For weeks now, Moretti had sensed that something was wrong, a wrongness he could not name but could feel the way old wounds feel weather. His enemy always seemed to be one step ahead of him. Shipments his men moved to intercept were rerouted hours before they arrived. Middlemen they had marked for questioning vanished from the city the night before the knock came. Sloane knew moves before they were made, anticipated roads before they were taken. And that could mean only one thing: someone was leaking from within. The thought gnawed at Moretti worse than any external threat ever had, because his trusted circle was small, deliberately small, and every name inside it belonged to someone he had chosen, someone he had built his life's architecture around. It was Rocco who uncovered the truth. After many nights spent quietly tracing every call, every account, every movement of every man with access to the inner rooms, he came to the study long after midnight and laid a thin folder on the desk without a word. And the name inside it made the entire room seem to stop breathing. Marcus Vale, the counselor with the perfect smile, the man who had stood at Moretti's right hand for 11 years, who had drafted his contracts and guarded his secrets, the man Moretti had lifted out of a debt-ridden nothing and shaped into one of the most capable minds in the city. It had been him from the very beginning, the figure lingering at the ends of hallways, the back turned in shadowed corners, the soft voice into a phone held too close, on too many nights when no one was supposed to be paying attention. Moretti summoned him the following evening, and when Vale walked into the study with his familiar courteous smile, Moretti said nothing at all. He only slid the folder across the desk. The smile on Vale's lips went out slowly, like a lamp on a dimmer. "I gave you everything," Moretti said, and the most frightening thing was that there was no rage in his voice, only a cold, aching sorrow. "I picked you up when you had nothing but creditors and a law degree. I trusted you like a brother. I let you into my home, sat you at my table, told you things I have never told another living soul, and you sold all of it to a man who poisons the sick. Why, Marcus?" Knowing there was no point in denial anymore, Vale let the mask drop, and the false courtesy fell away like a shattered shell, revealing the tired, cornered bitterness beneath. "Because Sloane owns me," he said. "The gambling debts you never knew about. He bought them all, every marker, 2 years ago. And because I was tired, Adrian, tired of being your shadow. You built an empire while I stood behind your chair holding your coat. Sloane promised me the one thing you never would: to be my own master, instead of the brilliant man standing forever behind the throne. You talk about loyalty. Loyalty doesn't cancel debts, and it doesn't give a man his own name." Moretti looked at him for a long time, and Sienna, standing silently in the doorway with the tea she would never deliver, saw in his eyes not the fury she had braced for, but a deep and terrible weariness. The loneliness of a man discovering that even inside his smallest circle, there had been no ground solid enough to stand on. This was the price of the world he lived in, a world where power could purchase obedience, but could never once purchase a heart. "You're wrong, Marcus," Moretti said softly, rising to his feet. "I never saw you as my shadow. You saw yourself that way. If you had come to me about the debts, I would have burned them in an afternoon. If you had asked for your own territory, your own name on a door, I would have given you the world. But you chose betrayal, and worse, you chose to stand beside a man who feeds poison to the dying." He gave Rocco a single silent nod, and that was all. No raised voice, no hand lifted. Vale was escorted from the room to face the consequences of his choice, cast out forever from the world he had betrayed, and the door closed behind him with a sound softer than a breath. When only the two of them remained, Moretti stood with his back to her, facing the window and the dark lake beyond it, his shoulders bowed beneath an invisible weight. "You see," he said, without turning around, "this is my world, a place where even the people I love can drive a knife into my back at any moment. You were right to want to take the boy far away from it." But Sienna did not leave. Instead, she crossed the room, stood beside him, and quietly set her mother's music box on the desk, winding the small brass key until the old lullaby rose steady into the silence between them. "You're not alone," she said softly. "Not anymore." But before being removed from the board, Marcus Vale had managed to hand Warren Sloane one final gift, and it was worth more than every dollar of his purchased debts. Moretti's schedule, his habits, the routes his cars favored, the hours he moved, the nights he traveled with only Rocco and a driver, and Sloane, who now knew exactly who was hunting him, and who understood that a man like Adrian Moretti would never stop until one of them was finished, made the decision of a cornered animal with everything left to lose. He would not wait for the knock. He would strike first. One reckless gamble with all of it, everything, pushed to the center of the table. That evening, before any of it began, Moretti and Sienna drove Eli out to the farmhouse of her oldest friend, beyond the city limits, a peaceful place with a wide snowy yard, a wood stove, and a patient old dog the boy had loved from the first minute. Eli waved goodbye to them through the warmly lit window, one paper boat clutched in his free hand, his face bright with the promise of a whole weekend of sledding, entirely carefree, entirely safe, knowing nothing at all of the storm gathering behind the horizon. And it was that image, that small hand waving through golden light, that would give Sienna the one thing she was going to need before the night was over: calm. The road back into the city cut through an abandoned industrial belt, warehouses standing like frozen ships in the snow, and it was there, on an old iron bridge above the rail yards, that the night tore open. Headlights burst from a side lot ahead, a second pair behind. Two cars slewed across the lanes, sealing the bridge at both ends, and the stillness shattered into engine roar and shouting and the flat, hard cracks of gunfire. Everything happened very fast. Rocco was already spinning the wheel, shouting for them to get down. Moretti moved faster. He seized Sienna and pushed her to the floor of the car, covering her with his own body. One arm locked around her shoulders, and above her head his voice came out with an astonishing, terrible calm. "Left side, Rocco. The gap by the rail. Now. Don't stop. Whatever happens, don't stop." Glass burst somewhere. The car lunged. Metal shrieked against metal. Sienna crouched against the floor, her heart slamming like a war drum, listening to the violent world she had spent her whole life avoiding explode all around her, and through all of it she felt the weight of the man shielding her, steady as a wall, making himself the only thing between her and the dark. Then Rocco found the seam. The engine roared. The car scraped through between bumper and railing with a scream of tearing steel, and they broke loose into the open night, the ambush collapsing into taillights and snow behind them. They had escaped, or so Sienna believed, until she lifted her head. In the dim, flickering wash of the passing streetlights, she saw him. Moretti was leaning back against the seat, too still, one hand pressed hard against his side, and between his fingers a dark stain was spreading, wider with every heartbeat. He had been shot while shielding her, and he had not said a single word, had clenched his teeth and endured it in silence until she was out of danger first. "Adrian!" The fear closed around her chest like a fist. He tried to give her a pale ghost of a smile, but the color was already draining from his face. "I'm fine," he said, and the weakness in his voice betrayed the words even as he spoke them. "As long as you're all right." From the front seat, Rocco's voice came tense and strained. The hospitals were impossible. Sloane's people had eyes on every emergency room in the county by now, waiting for exactly this. Bringing him through those doors would be no different from delivering him to his death. And in that terrifying moment, as the life of the man she had slowly, unwillingly, completely come to love, slipped away in front of her eyes, Sienna understood with sudden, freezing clarity that the only person who could save him now, in a night with no doctors, no hospital, and nothing but her mother's worn medical bag on the seat beside her, was her. Something inside Sienna rose at once, a cold, clear, calm she had not known she still possessed. The instinct forged through 10 years beside sick beds and life or death nights. The fear did not disappear. It simply stepped back, making room for the nurse. Somewhere hidden. "Rocco," she ordered, her voice not her own and entirely her own. "Out of sight, now." The car swung off the main road and plunged down a lakeside lane, and minutes later they carried him through the broken doors of an abandoned chapel near the shore, a small stone ruin with snow drifting through its shattered windows, and the wind keening through the empty frames like a voice that had forgotten its words. Sienna spread her coat across the cold stone floor. They laid him down on it, and she tore his shirt open along the wound, and the hands that had trembled in a snowstorm on the night they met, now moved with a precision that astonished even her. 10 years of training pouring itself into a single hour. She packed the wound. She pressed down with all her weight to slow the bleeding. She took from her mother's bag the few instruments her mother had taught her never to travel without, and she began the battle to wrest his life back from the dark. Right there on the floor of a ruined church, with no machines, no surgical lights, no one to assist her, only herself, and everything her mother had left her. "Stay awake. Do you hear me, Adrian? Look at me. Don't close your eyes." But his face was turning gray beneath the thin light, his breathing growing shallower, faster. And then she heard it begin. The sound she knew from that first night in the subway. The thin, strangled whistle of his airway closing. The blood loss was dragging him down into shock, and the old terror was rising to meet it. The silence of the dark chapel wrapping around him like the inside of a wardrobe, and his chest was locking shut exactly as it had for 24 years, suffocating him in the still, quiet, dark, and Sienna understood what she had to do. She pressed 2 fingers to his throat, finding the pulse, weak and slow and stumbling, and she bent close over him, and she began to hum, the old lullaby, the melody from the brass box, the song his mother had breathed through the crack of a wardrobe door so her son would not be afraid, the song her own mother had wound into the night air while her breathing slowed. And in that moment, the terrible, beautiful truth of it broke over her completely. Now she understood, down to the marrow of her bones, the feeling he had carried for 24 years, the feeling that had been hers beside her mother's bed. She was the one with her fingers on a fading pulse. She was the one counting each beat, as though counting alone could hold him here. She was the one who did not dare blink, did not dare let the song falter, believing with everything in her that as long as the music had not stopped, he had not left. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Her hands did not tremble. "Do you hear me, Adrian Moretti?" she whispered between the phrases of the melody, pressing hard against the wound, never breaking the thread of the song. "The song hasn't stopped. So you are not allowed to leave. Eli needs you. I need you. We still have a whole life ahead of us to heal each other. So stay. Fight. Show me this song doesn't lie." And as if the melody and her voice together had anchored him to the world, as if the deepest, most wounded part of him had finally heard the only promise it had ever waited for, the pulse beneath her fingertips slowly steadied. It stopped stumbling. It grew stronger, beat by beat. The bleeding slowed beneath her skilled and unshaking hands, and his breathing, though shallow, opened and found its rhythm again. The woman this city had thrown away had just won back the life of the most powerful man she had ever known. On the stone floor of a ruined chapel, in the darkest and most desperate place of all, with nothing but her mother's old bag, 10 years of devotion, and a lullaby that refused to end. When the immediate danger had passed and his pulse could hold its own rhythm without her fingers pressed to it, Rocco found them a place to disappear, a discreet house buried at the end of a snowed-in lane outside the city, where no one asked questions and no light reached the road. They carried him inside, and the hours that followed passed in a waiting so tense it felt almost suffocating. Sienna did not leave his side by even half a step. She changed the dressings by lamplight, watched every rise and fall of his chest, checked his temperature with the back of her hand against his forehead, the way her mother had once done to her. And on the pillow beside his head, she set the brass music box, winding it each time it wound down, so that the old lullaby would stay with him even in the depths of his fevered sleep, so that wherever the darkness had carried him, some part of him would know the song had not stopped. She had kept watch through many nights beside many beds in her life. But no night had ever been as long as this one. No night had ever made every single breath of another human being mean so much. She held his hand, the hand that had once made hardened men tremble across a room, now lying motionless and weak inside both of hers, and she talked to him softly, though she did not know whether he could hear her at all. She told him about the ordinary things, the small, unremarkable things she had never dared to dream of until he had stepped out of the dark of that subway station and into her life, teaching Eli to ride a bicycle in the spring, running behind him down some quiet path with her hand on the seat, morning coffee, 2 cups, no hurry. Long afternoons by the lake when the ice finally let go of the shore, a home where the lights could be turned off at night, because no one inside it was afraid of the quiet anymore, and when the first ray of dawn slipped through the gap in the curtains and laid a thin band of gold across the blanket, she felt his fingers move faintly inside her hands. She looked up sharply, her heart catching in her throat. His eyelids opened, slowly, heavily. For a moment his gaze was still hazy and lost, drifting across the ceiling as though he were searching for the road back from somewhere very far away. Then his eyes found her face, and stopped, and something inside them cleared, and softened, and came home. Sienna waited, tears already gathering at the edges of her vision. She waited for him to ask about the wound, about Sloane, about Rocco and the men, and whether they were safe, but he asked none of those things. His dry, cracked lips moved faintly, and what came out was only a few words, barely more than breath, and yet they held an entire world inside them. The song hasn't stopped. It was not a question. It was a truth he needed to speak aloud in order to believe it was real. Because for 24 years, every time he had closed his eyes, he had lived inside the fear of opening them again into silence. The fear that the song would be gone, and the person beside him with it, the way it had been gone that morning, when a 12-year-old boy finally pushed open a wardrobe door. He was used to waking into emptiness. He had built a fortress of burning lights around that emptiness, but this time was different. This time he opened his eyes, and the melody was still turning softly on the pillow beside him, and she was still there. The tears Sienna had been holding back all night finally rolled down her cheeks, tears of an emotion she could find no single name for. Relief and exhaustion and a love so deep it ached in her chest like a second heartbeat. "It hasn't stopped," she answered, her voice breaking as she tightened her hands around his. "And it's not going to. I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long time, and in that gaze was everything the two of them had never once said aloud, every confession neither had ever spoken. Because between them, love had never been a matter of words. It was presence. It was staying. It was one person keeping watch so the other could sleep through the darkest night of all, one hand refusing to let go of a fading pulse, one song that would not surrender to the silence. He squeezed her hand, weakly, but with everything he had, and in that small room washed with dawn, with the lullaby turning gently beside his pillow, two people who had once been broken in the very same place quietly became each other's peace. When Adrian was strong enough to sit up against the pillows, the two of them began the work that Sienna could never have done alone, and that he, for all his power, could never have finished without her. The documents she had guarded for over a year, the concentration reports, the mismatched batch numbers, the records she had quietly copied in her final days at Street, Augustine and carried through homeless nights, like a drowning woman, clinging to the last piece of broken wood, were laid side by side with everything his organization had unearthed. The shell companies, the rerouted shipments, the gray market sales stretching across 3 states, the money, traced dollar by dollar, flowing from the veins of the dying into accounts that all, in the end, answered to one signature, Warren Sloane's. Alone, her evidence had been the word of a disgraced nurse against a pillar of the city. Alone, his evidence was the work of shadows, unusable in the light. Together, they became something that neither Sloane's power, nor his money, nor his charity gala smile could bury. This time, Sienna was not standing by herself in an office on the 9th floor, watching men in suits exchange glances over her head. This time her voice was amplified by proof that could not be dismissed, placed carefully, piece by piece, into the right hands. Investigators who could not be bought, journalists who could not be frightened, hands capable of turning a whisper into thunder. And thunder is what it became. The truth about what Sloane had done, about the innocent people who had paid with their health and their lives so that his hidden accounts could swell, broke over the city like the spring cracking of lake ice. The empire of lies he had spent a decade building collapsed in the space of weeks. The hospital board that had once applauded him now scrambled to disown him. The face from the brochures became the face on the evening news, and the man so long accustomed to standing above others, deciding from carpeted offices who would receive real medicine and who would receive water, was stripped of everything he had ever used to trample the people beneath him, and made to stand, for the first time in his gilded life, level with his consequences. For Sienna, justice did not arrive wearing the face of revenge. It arrived quieter than that, and it arrived deeper. It came as truth returned to its rightful place. Her license was restored. The stamp was lifted from her file, and the people who had once walked her out of that building had to acknowledge, publicly, that the woman they had thrown away had been the only one brave enough to tell the truth from the very beginning. But what warmed her heart most was none of that. It was a single line in the investigators' findings, one name among the victims whose records had helped expose the crime. Her mother's. Her mother's death was no longer a meaningless loss, no longer a failure Sienna carried alone in the dark. It had become part of the proof, part of the reckoning, part of what would now save countless strangers from meeting the same fate in the same infusion chairs. And in that, at last, Sienna felt she had kept faith with the person she had once watched leave this world while her trained hands lay helpless. For Adrian, Sloane's fall carried another meaning, one far older and far deeper. One night, when he could stand again, she found him by the tall window of the safe house, watching the far glow of the city lights, and he spoke in a voice touched with a stillness she had never heard from him before. 24 years, he said. 24 years I punished myself for surviving that wardrobe, for sitting in the dark, doing nothing while the song stopped. I believed that if I ever allowed myself peace, if I ever slept soundly like a man with a clear heart, it would mean I had forgotten her, that I had betrayed her. So I kept every light burning and I kept every night sleepless, as if that were the debt I owed. He turned to her, and his eyes were clear. But I was wrong. She didn't sing so that I would stop living the moment the song ended. She sang so that I would live. That was the whole of it. That was everything she wanted, standing at that door. And it took a stranger in a snowstorm, humming her melody, for me to finally hear it. Sienna crossed the room and rested her head against his shoulder, and the city lights trembled far away like a field of fallen stars. She would be proud of you, she said softly. Proud of the man you've become. Proud of the man you chose to become. And that night, for the first time in 24 years, Adrian Moretti closed his eyes in a dark and quiet room without fear, not because someone was keeping watch over him, but because he had finally forgiven himself. Many months had passed since that fateful winter, and on a clear spring morning, golden sunlight poured through the tall glass windows overlooking Lake Michigan, where the last of the ice had finally let go of the shore, and the water lay blue and open all the way to the horizon. The home above the lake was no longer the cold, empty fortress Sienna had stepped into on that snow-blind night so long ago. Now it was filled with the small, warm disorder of a life truly being lived. Drawings taped to the refrigerator, a bicycle helmet by the door, waiting for the weekend, a fleet of paper boats sailing along every windowsill. In the kitchen, Eli sat on a high stool, swinging his legs and eating pancakes, while telling a long, winding, endless story about the dream he had dreamed the night before, something about a dog who could sled in a boat as big as the moon, and his bright, clear laughter rang through the rooms like the most beautiful music, melting every last cold corner of the house the way spring sunlight melts the frost. Sienna stood by the stove, making 2 cups of coffee, smiling as she listened, her heart filled with a peace she had once believed she would never be allowed to touch. And in the study, on the corner of the great desk, a small paper boat, its folds gone soft and its color long faded, still stood exactly where it had been placed, keeping its silent watch. In the next room, Adrian Moretti was still asleep, the man who had once gone 24 years without daring to trust the dark, who had once paced the halls of his own home like something caged, now lay with a peaceful face, his breathing deep and even, sunk in a full and quiet rest, and not a single lamp was burning anywhere in the room. On the small table beside the bed, her mother's brass music box sat silent, its key unwound, because Sienna understood now what she could not have understood at the beginning. It was never truly the music box that healed him. The melody had only been the doorway, the first gentle word spoken to a wounded heart, telling it that it was safe. What truly healed him was everything that came after. The presence of someone who stayed, the certainty that when he closed his eyes at night, he would not wake into loneliness, the quiet, enduring love of a home where he finally belonged. She carried the coffee in and stood watching him sleep for a little while longer, and as though he sensed her there, he slowly opened his eyes, and this time there was no panic in them, No lost searching, no fear of the silence, only a gentle smile forming as he found her face. And beyond her, the sound of Eli's laughter drifting in from the kitchen. "Good morning," he said, his voice still heavy with sleep, but warm as the light on the water. "Good morning," she answered. And in that simple moment, no power, no fortune, no empire in this world could compare with what they had. Because at last, after all the breaking and all the loss, two shattered people had found the one thing money could never buy and power could never seize: a peaceful place to belong, a hand to hold in the darkness, and a reason to wake each morning with a smile. And if Sienna's journey teaches us anything, it is this: kindness, no matter how small, no matter how quietly it is given on the coldest and stormiest night, always finds its way back home. Sometimes, in the very moment we believe we have lost everything, we are standing closer than we have ever been to the most precious thing we will ever find. And what heals the deepest wounds of the human soul has never been power or wealth, but the feeling of being safe, being understood, and being loved by someone willing to stay beside us, even through the darkest night, until the song of dawn begins. If the story of Sienna and Adrian has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video, so that together we can spread meaningful stories to more people every single day. We would truly love to hear the feelings from deep inside your heart. Has there ever been a moment in your life when a small act of kindness came back to you when you least expected it? What moved you most in this story, and what lesson will you carry with you from it? Please do not hesitate to leave a comment below and share your thoughts, because every word you write is a light that helps this community grow warmer. Thank you, from the bottom of our hearts, for taking the time to listen all the way to this very final moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, peaceful hearts, joyful days, and many simple, gentle happinesses in your everyday life. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next story.